The story begins in a forgotten kingdom, a land once blessed with fertile fields and proud cities, now drowned in silence. The sound of laughter had long faded, replaced only by whispers of fear. At the center of it all sat one man, the king. To his people, he was not a ruler, but a shadow draped in velvet robes. His throne, carved of dark wood and stained with the blood of countless enemies, stood as a reminder of the price of disobedience. The king's rise to power had been swift and merciless. He was not born with the crown upon his head. He seized it with hands already red. Brothers, rivals, and even friends who stood in his path met the executioner's blade. From the very beginning, cruelty was not a tool for him. It was his nature. In the early years, the nobles believed his terror would keep order. The peasants, though afraid, hoped his iron will would protect them from invaders. But soon they discovered a truth darker than war. The greatest enemy was not outside their walls. It was the man who ruled them. Inside the palace, the air was heavy, not with incense or perfume, but with dread. Servants walked as though stepping on broken glass. Every word they spoke might be overheard, twisted, and reported. The king's eyes missed nothing. His voice was enough to freeze a room, his silence even worse. Court life became theatre, but one written only for his pleasure. Ministers bowed too low, nobles laughed too loudly at his cruel jokes, and courtiers dared not breathe when his moods shifted. All knew the punishment for displeasing him was not merely death, but death designed as a warning. Yet, perhaps most disturbing of all, was how the king found beauty in suffering. He believed fear was the purest loyalty. To him, kindness was weakness and mercy was a disease. In his mind, love could not bind subjects to a ruler, but terror could. And so, his throne was more than a seat of power. It was a stage for cruelty, a place where every judgment was not just law, but spectacle. The throne room became infamous across the land. Children whispered of it at night, calling it the Hall of Screams. Nobles avoided its marble steps, servants dreaded its echoing chambers, and yet no one dared to flee, because in this kingdom there was no escape. His eyes reached every village. His soldiers hunted every whisper of rebellion. The king ruled not with laws, but with fear itself. And in this shadow, in this blood-stained throne room, a nightmare was waiting to be born. For cruelty, once begun, demands more cruelty. And the king's hunger was only just beginning. The kingdom was quiet, too quiet. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of terror. Every street, every home carried the weight of invisible eyes. Even the wind seemed afraid to blow too hard, lest it disturb the king's restless spirit. The people had learned the art of survival, not by living, but by hiding. Words were measured like drops of water in a drought. A wrong phrase, an innocent joke, even a glance could be twisted into treason. And treason, under this king, was punished not with exile, but with horror. The king's soldiers, his loyal hounds, stalked the villages. They did not march with banners or drums. They arrived in the dead of night, boots pressing against cobblestones, torches flickering like the eyes of demons. When they came, doors were forced open, families torn apart. A single accusation, often false, could erase a name from existence. No trial, no defense, only judgment. And judgment meant death, or worse. But it was not just executions that spread fear. The king was inventive, crafting punishments not to end lives swiftly, but to break spirits. He believed that true control came when the people themselves became the instruments of their own suffering. In the market square, gallows stood not as a tool of justice, but as decoration. At any moment, a body could be seen dangling, swaying gently in the wind like a grotesque flag of loyalty. The smell of iron and blood clung to the air, so constant that it became part of the city's scent. Children grew up, not with lullabies, but with warnings. Mothers whispered, "Stay silent. Don't look. Don't question." Fear became a cradle, rocking every soul to obedience. Even in the countryside, far from the palace, peasants spoke of the king as if he were a ghost who could hear every word. Inside the palace walls, fear was sharper still. Courtiers smiled with trembling lips. Nobles bowed until their spines ached. Ministers wrote reports praising his greatness, even as they prayed he would not notice them. To be unseen was a blessing. To be seen was a danger. Whispers filled the night corridors, maids sharing secrets in hushed tones, guards muttering about disappearances. But each whisper risked betrayal, for spies were everywhere. Some servants vanished overnight, dragged into the shadows without explanation. The next morning, their rooms stood empty, their names forbidden to speak. It was in these shadows that terror grew roots. The king no longer needed chains to hold his people. Their minds were already bound. Fear had seeped into every corner of life. It lived in their dreams, it stalked their waking hours, it silenced their prayers. And yet, deep within, one question haunted them all. If this was only the beginning, what new horrors awaited? For the king's cruelty was not satisfied. His appetite for control demanded more. The darkness had only begun to spread. The grand hall of the palace glittered with gold and jewels, but beneath the shimmer lay something far darker. Tonight was no ordinary feast. It was a theatre of madness, staged by a king who craved not food, but fear. Silken curtains hung from the walls, and chandeliers glowed with hundreds of candles. The nobles sat uneasily at long tables, their plates filled with delicacies from distant lands, roasted pheasants, honeyed fruits, steaming breads. The air smelled of spices and wine, yet no one dared to eat until the king lifted his goblet. When he finally rose, the hall fell into silence. His smile was thin, his eyes glinting with cruel delight. "Tonight," he declared, "we dine not merely to fill our bellies, but to honor loyalty. And what better way than to test devotion?" At his signal, guards dragged in trembling servants. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with terror. The nobles shifted in their seats, but none dared to speak. They had seen such games before. The king clapped his hands. Platters were set before the servants, but these were no feasts. Upon the silver dishes lay horrors, flesh carved from the bodies of those who had been punished earlier that day. Still, warm, still bleeding, gasps rippled through the hall. A noblewoman covered her mouth, nearly fainting, but a sharp look from the king froze her in place. "Eat," he commanded. The servants shook their heads, tears streaming down their cheeks. One fell to his knees, begging for mercy. But mercy was a word the king had long erased from his kingdom. When the servants hesitated, the king's smile turned into a snarl. He motioned to his guards, who seized one trembling man, forcing the flesh against his lips. The hall filled with the sound of muffled screams. The nobles sat frozen, their hands clutching their goblets, their faces pale as marble. The king leaned back in his throne, savoring every moment. This was not about hunger. It was about domination. He wanted them all, noble and servant alike, to understand that he controlled not just their bodies, but their very will. "See how loyalty tastes," he mocked, lifting his wine. "See how obedience feeds the soul." Some servants choked on their sobs, others collapsed, fainting. But a few, broken beyond resistance, obeyed. With shaking hands, they raised the meat to their mouths. Their bodies convulsed with each bite, but they chewed, because to refuse was to die. The hall reeked of terror more than food. Nobles looked away, but the king would not allow it. He forced them to watch, reminding them that silence made them complicit. When it was over, the servants lay collapsed, some unconscious, others broken shells of what they had been. The king stood, applauding slowly, his voice echoing. "Let it be known, here loyalty is not spoken, it is eaten. That night, no one in the palace slept. The banquet of horror became legend, whispered only in shadows. It was proof that the king's cruelty knew no bounds, and that he was only beginning. The king's banquet of horror had ended, but its echo lingered in every corner of the palace. By day, the halls still glistened with gold, but by night, shadows seemed to crawl across the walls, carrying the sound of faint sobs, broken prayers, and whispers that no one dared to speak aloud. The servants moved like ghosts, silent, trembling, avoiding the king's gaze. Every clatter of a dropped cup, every misplaced step, felt like a death sentence. No one knew who would be chosen next for his cruel entertainments, and so the palace became a prison where fear itself was the jailer. But fear has a way of breeding, whispers. Behind closed doors, nobles muttered among themselves. They spoke in hushed tones about the king's madness, about the banquet that had defiled not only bodies, but souls. They asked how long such cruelty could continue, and whether they might be next. Yet even as they whispered, their eyes darted to the shadows, afraid that the walls themselves were listening, because the king had spies everywhere. The guards, loyal only to him, roamed the corridors at night, pressing their ears to doors, listening for treason. Even the servants, desperate to survive, sometimes betrayed one another, hoping to earn the king's favor. A single careless word could bring ruin, and so every whisper carried the weight of life and death. There were rumors that the king enjoyed this, that he encouraged the whispers, even fed them, planting fear like seeds, watching them grow into paranoia. For him, the palace was not just a home, but a stage, and every whisper was part of his crew. Loyalty, once the foundation of the king's rule, was beginning to crack. For years, the guards, nobles, and servants had bowed to him without question. His crown, his armies, his wealth, they had made him untouchable. But cruelty has a strange way of poisoning loyalty. It does not command respect. It breeds resentment. And now, that resentment was beginning to rot the palace from within. The guards, once proud protectors of the throne, began to whisper among themselves. They had witnessed too much. Banquets of horror, punishments that defied reason, servants reduced to trembling shells of their former selves. They told themselves they were only following orders, but at night, when they closed their eyes, they could still hear the screams echoing in their skulls. Guilt gnawed at them, and guilt is the enemy of loyalty. Some of the king's most trusted men began to falter. One captain, once famed for his devotion, was seen hesitating when commanded to punish a servant. Another, trembling, dared to question why such cruelty was necessary. Both men vanished the next morning, dragged away in silence. Their absence was never explained, but their fate was clear. The nobles, too, were changing. At first, they had laughed at the king's cruel games, seeing them as displays of strength. But now, their laughter had dried into uneasy silence. They realized that their own lives were at stake, that their wealth and titles could not shield them forever, and so they began to withdraw. Banquets once filled with flattery grew thin with words. Eyes that once looked at the king with admiration now looked at him with fear, and behind that fear, contempt. Even within the palace walls, the servants, the lowest and most powerless, were shifting. Broken though they were, they began to look at one another differently, not just as victims, but as silent allies. Each act of cruelty brought them closer together. A piece of bread shared in secret, a warning whispered before a guard entered, a look of solidarity in the face of terror. Small acts of defiance, invisible to the king, yet powerful in their quiet unity. The king, however, remained blind. Or perhaps he saw it and simply did not care. To him, loyalty was irrelevant. He believed fear was stronger, that it could chain men more tightly than devotion ever could. What he did not understand was that fear corrodes from within. It bends people, yes, but bends something too far, and it will eventually break. and break it did. The first signs came in subtle betrayals. A guard deliberately delayed in delivering a command. A servant failed to report a whisper he overheard. A noble passed a secret message to another, urging caution, hinting at plans. These were small cracks, but together they began to split the very foundation of his rule. The king still strutted through his palace, cloaked in power, certain of his control. But beneath him, the ground was shifting. His loyal subjects were no longer bound by devotion. Their silence was no longer obedience. It was plotting. The fall of loyalty had begun. It began not with a sword, but with a whisper. One evening, in the shadowed corners of the palace kitchens, a servant leaned close to another and dared to speak what had never been spoken aloud. "We cannot live like this anymore." The words hung heavy in the air, trembling with danger. For to speak against the king was treason. But treason, once spoken, has a way of spreading. The servants were the first to ignite. They had borne the brunt of the king's madness, the endless humiliations, the forced horrors, the punishments beyond imagination. Each day they lived in terror. But terror, when pressed too far, transforms into something else: desperation. And desperation, when shared, becomes rebellion. The spark was fanned by small acts of defiance. A loaf of bread hidden from the king's table and smuggled to the starving. A servant pretending to obey but secretly sabotaging orders. A cook slipping too much salt into the king's food, watching in silence as his face twisted in anger. These were not weapons, but they were the beginnings of resistance. The guards, too, began to shift. Many of them had followed orders blindly, believing loyalty was their duty. But now, even the hardiest among them were weary. They had seen their comrades executed for the smallest hesitation. They had punished innocents until their own souls felt stained. And slowly, a few of them began to question whether serving the king was truly survival, or if it was a death sentence waiting to come. One night, a young guard, trembling, approached a group of servants. Instead of threatening them, he whispered, "If the time comes, I will stand with you." It was a dangerous promise, but it spread like fire through dry grass. The king's iron grip was loosening, though he did not yet realize it. The nobles were the last to waver, but even they felt the heat of rebellion. Their fine clothes and golden titles no longer protected them from the king's paranoia. They had seen fellow lords disappear without warning. Their wealth could not buy safety, and so they began to conspire in shadows, sending secret messages beyond the palace walls, calling upon old allies, rival kingdoms, even mercenaries who despised the tyrant. The palace was a powder keg, and all it needed was a spark. That spark came one fateful evening. During a grand feast, when the king demanded yet another display of cruelty, a servant refused. His voice, though trembling, rang clear across the hall. "No more." Gasps filled the chamber. The king's face darkened with fury, and he rose to strike. But before he could, another servant stepped forward. Then another. Then, shockingly, a guard lowered his spear. In that moment, the silence broke. Loyalty shattered. Fear transformed into courage. The rebellion had begun, not with armies at the gates, but within the very heart of the king's palace. And though the king still believed himself invincible, the fire that would consume his throne had already been lit. The grand hall of the palace shimmered with torchlight. Golden plates gleamed, goblets overflowed with wine, and roasted meats filled the air with a heavy, suffocating aroma. It was a feast meant to display the king's power, a banquet of excess while the kingdom outside starved. The tyrant sat upon his throne-like chair at the head of the table, his eyes wild, his laughter sharp and hollow. Around him, nobles and guards pretended to smile, though every glance, every gesture carried the weight of dread. They had gathered not to celebrate, but to survive. The king raised his goblet high. "Tonight we honor my reign," he bellowed, "a reign built upon fear, upon obedience, upon my unshakable rule." The hall echoed with forced applause. Yet beneath the clapping, whispers wove through the chamber like shadows. Servants exchanged secret nods. Guards shifted uneasily at their posts. Nobles clutched their goblets, their hands trembling not with loyalty, but with anticipation. For this was not merely a feast, it was a stage, and tonight the curtain was about to fall on the king's reign. The first act of defiance came quietly. A servant poured the king's wine, but his eyes did not lower in submission. He met the king's gaze, steady and unyielding. The king sneered, raising the goblet to drink, only to pause, sensing something amiss. The hall held its breath. Was the wine poisoned? Or was it only his growing paranoia? Before he could decide, a second act of rebellion struck. A guard, once loyal, stepped away from his post and let his spear fall to the marble floor with a resounding clang. The sound tore through the hall, louder than any cheer. The king froze. All eyes turned. The silence was broken by a voice, not of a noble, but of a servant. "Your reign ends tonight," gasps filled the chamber. The king rose in fury, slamming his goblet onto the table, his face twisted with rage as he shouted, "Traitors, all of you!" His voice thundered, but the thunder no longer carried fear. One by one, servants stepped forward. Guards lowered their weapons. Even nobles, emboldened by the moment, leaned back in their chairs with a cold, quiet defiance. The king's throne, once the symbol of untouchable power, now seemed small, fragile beneath his trembling hands. Desperate, he demanded loyalty. "I am your king. Kneel before me." But no one moved. Not a single knee bent. The silence that followed was not fear. It was the sound of chains breaking. The feast, meant to glorify his reign, had transformed into his trial. His hall of celebration had become a courtroom. His guests were no longer subjects, but judges. And for the first time in his life, the king felt what he had so freely dealt to others. Fear. The rebellion had found its voice. The tyrant's last feast had begun. The torches in the great hall flickered as if the flames themselves feared what was about to happen. The king, once untouchable, stood trembling before those he had ruled through terror, his crown tilted, his robe dragging along the floor, symbols of power now reduced to tatters of mockery. For the first time in decades, the hall was silent, not out of obedience, but because the people were listening to something greater than fear, the sound of justice, the weight of long-suppressed defiance. The king tried to speak, his voice cracked. You cannot defy me. I am your master, your ruler, chosen by the gods." But his words carried no weight anymore. The gods had abandoned him, or perhaps they had never chosen him at all. A guard, one of his oldest protectors, stepped forward. His armor clinked as he drew his sword, but instead of saluting, he pointed the blade at the tyrant. His voice was steady. "No more, my king. The people will not bleed for you any longer." The hall erupted in shouts, servants, soldiers, nobles all raising their voices in unity. The throne room, once filled with whispers of fear, now thundered with the roar of rebellion. The king staggered back. His eyes darted from face to face.